Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. How does a wife's lie about having an open relationship explode when her husband's friend sends a revealing text message? What happens when a woman who insists everyone agreed to new rules discovers her husband has been quietly documenting every manipulation? Can a manipulative spouse survive the moment when legal papers arrive in front of the very people she tried to deceive? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Cressida Thorne, and I thought I had it all figured out. Marriage, career, freedom. I believed in evolving, in refusing to be boxed in by what people think a wife should be. Derek and I had been together for 9 years, married for most of them, and somewhere along the way things got comfortable. Too comfortable. He worked long hours managing engineering projects. I climbed the ladder at my marketing firm. We had Ivy, our 7-year-old, who made everything feel worthwhile, even when the rest felt like routine. But routine isn't the same as passion, and I needed to feel alive again. That's when Landon came back into the picture. Derek's old college friend, someone we both knew from way back. He worked in finance now, charming as ever, the kind of person who made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. We'd run into each other at a work mixer, and he'd asked about Derek. I told him we were doing fine, that modern marriage was about growth and flexibility. He laughed and said Derek was lucky to have someone so open-minded. I liked how that sounded. Open-minded, progressive, not trapped. The morning it really started, I was standing in our kitchen making coffee. The sun came through the window over the sink, warming the countertop. Derek sat at the breakfast nook, reading something on his tablet, probably work emails. Ivy was upstairs getting dressed for school. I poured 2 cups, set one in front of him, and decided it was time to have the conversation. The one I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. I told him we needed to talk about boundaries. He looked up, patient like he always was, and asked what I meant. I said that marriage was changing, that people our age were realizing that love didn't mean ownership. He set his tablet down and waited. I took a breath and said we should consider opening our relationship, that it would help us grow individually while staying committed to each other and to Ivy, that it was about emotional availability and maintaining the spark. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not angry, not hurt, just quiet. Finally, he asked if I was serious. I laughed a little, trying to keep it light, and said, of course I was, that we'd talked about flexibility before, about how growth-oriented partnerships worked. He said he didn't remember agreeing to anything like this. I told him we'd discussed it implicitly, that it was part of being progressive. He took a sip of his coffee and said nothing else. I kept talking, filling the silence. I said lots of couples do this now, that it didn't mean we loved each other any less, that maybe he'd feel differently if he thought about it for a while. He nodded slowly, his face calm, and told me he trusted I'd make the right decision. The way he said it felt strange, like he was speaking to a stranger. I said he sounded like a teacher scolding a child. He said I sounded like someone trying to make a point instead of a promise. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I changed the subject, asked if he'd pick up Ivy from school later. He said sure. Then he stood up, rinsed his mug carefully, and set it on the counter far from mine. I noticed that. 2 mugs, 2 separate corners. He kissed Ivy goodbye when she came downstairs, grabbed his jacket, and left without another word to me. I sat there for a minute, staring at my coffee, telling myself it went well, that he just needed time to process, that he'd come around once he saw how mature I was being about the whole thing. I called my mother later that morning. She's always been supportive, a retired professor who believes in challenging norms. I told her what I'd said to Derek. She said I was brave, that too many women stay silent about their needs. that Derek had always been a bit too serious, and that I shouldn't let his discomfort hold me back. Her words made me feel justified, validated, like I was doing something important, something that would make our marriage stronger in the long run. I texted Landon that afternoon. I told him Derek and I had talked, that we were moving toward a more open arrangement. He sent back a heart emoji and said he'd been hoping I'd say that. I felt a thrill run through me, the kind I hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, Derek was at work, sitting in a glass-walled conference room with 3 engineers and a project timeline that needed adjusting. His phone was face down on the table, silent. Halfway through the meeting, it buzzed. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again. One of his colleagues, a woman named Sarah, glanced at it and smiled. She said it looked like someone really wanted to reach him. He picked it up to silence it and saw the notification. A text from Landon. The preview showed clearly on the lock screen. "Baby, tonight at my place? Can't wait to have you alone again," followed by a winking emoji. Derek stared at the screen. His hand didn't shake. He didn't gasp or stand up or make a scene. He just read it twice, then a third time, and slowly set the phone back down. Sarah asked if everything was okay. He said yes, that he just needed a minute. He excused himself, walked into the hallway, and stood by the window overlooking the parking lot. He opened the message thread. The text was meant for someone else. For me. Landon had sent it to the wrong contact. Derek scrolled up and saw a history he hadn't known existed. Not explicit, but flirty. Familiar. Comfortable. He took a screenshot, forwarded it to his personal email, and saved it in a cloud folder. Then he deleted the forward notification, so I wouldn't see he'd done it. He went back into the meeting, apologized for the interruption, and spent the next hour pretending to care about engineering timelines, while his mind catalogued everything that had just shifted. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind. He opened his laptop and created a new folder. He labeled it Household. Inside, he started a simple document, a timeline, dates, events, things I'd said, things I'd claimed we'd agreed on. He didn't write it in anger. He wrote it the way he managed projects at work, with clear headings and bullet points. At the bottom of the document, he added one line, received text from L meant for C, screenshot saved, date and time stamped. He sat back and stared at the screen. His colleague Omar had texted him, asking if he wanted to hit the gym after work. Derek replied that he'd meet him there. Then he closed the laptop, gathered his things, and left the office. On his way out, his phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Downtown 3:45 p.m. He'd set it days ago. A consultation appointment he hadn't told me about. That evening, I noticed something different. Derek came home later than usual. He said he'd stopped by the gym. He seemed fine, maybe a little distant but not angry, not confrontational, just quiet. I asked if he'd thought about what we talked about that morning. He said he had. I asked what he thought. He said he needed time to process. I told him that was fair, that I appreciated him being open to the conversation. He nodded, went upstairs, and I heard the shower running. When he came back down, he was dressed in sweats and a t-shirt. He made himself a sandwich, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop. I asked what he was working on. He said just organizing some files. I didn't think much of it. Derek was always organized. I went upstairs to check on Ivy, who was drawing in her room. She asked if Daddy was okay. I said of course he was. Why would she ask that? She said he seemed quieter than usual. I told her grown-ups just get tired sometimes. Later that night, after Ivy was asleep, I checked my phone. Landon had texted asking if we were still on for tomorrow. I replied that I'd let him know. I felt a little nervous, a little excited. I told myself Derek would adjust, that this was healthy, that we were evolving. I heard a faint mechanical sound from down the hall. I walked toward it and realized it was coming from the guest room. The door was cracked open. I saw Derek sitting at the small desk in there, a printer on the floor beside him, slowly pushing out pages. He didn't see me. I stepped back and went to bed. The next day, I met Landon at an upscale wine bar downtown. It had an outdoor terrace with string lights and small tables overlooking the street. We ordered a bottle of white wine and talked about work, about life, about how freeing it felt to not be constrained by old rules. He asked again if Derek was really okay with this. I said of course he was, that we'd had a mature conversation about it, that he understood modern partnerships were about trust and space. Landon laughed and said Derek always was the reasonable one. I felt proud of that. Like I'd convinced someone else of something I still wasn't sure I believed myself. We talked for 2 hours. He touched my hand across the table. I didn't pull away. At one point, he said he'd been thinking about me ever since we reconnected, that he couldn't believe Derek was willing to share someone like me. I said it wasn't about sharing, it was about recognizing that people are whole on their own. He nodded like that made sense, but I could tell he didn't really care about the philosophy. He just wanted what he wanted. When I got home that night, Derek was already in the guest room. I knocked lightly and asked if he was coming to bed. He said he had some work to finish. I said it was late. He said he'd be fine. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I should push harder, but I didn't. I went to our bedroom alone. The sheets on his side were cold and smooth, untouched. I lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was making a mistake. But then I told myself it was just an adjustment period, that he'd see how good this could be. The next morning, Derek woke up before me. When I came downstairs, he was already gone. There was a note on the counter. Taking Ivy to school. See you tonight. His handwriting was neat, controlled. I made coffee and sat in the same spot where I'd had the conversation with him just 2 days ago. It felt different now, emptier. That evening, Derek came home and asked if we could talk. I said of course. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and pulled out his phone. He opened the messages app and turned the screen toward me. I saw the text from Landon. Baby, tonight at my place. Can't wait to have you alone again. My stomach dropped. I felt my face go hot. I tried to laugh it off, said it must be some kind of joke. He asked if I was sleeping with Landon. I said no, that Landon was just being flirty, that it didn't mean anything. He asked why Landon thought he could text me like that. I said I didn't know, that maybe he'd misunderstood the boundaries I'd set. Derek looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked when I'd told Landon we had an open relationship. I said I'd mentioned we were exploring flexibility. He said he never agreed to that. I said we'd discussed it. He said no, I'd announced it. There was a difference. I felt myself getting defensive. I told him he was being controlling, that he couldn't handle the idea of me having agency. He said agency and betrayal were not the same thing. I stood up, said I wasn't going to sit there and be interrogated. He stayed seated. He said he wasn't interrogating me. He was asking for the truth. I told him the truth was that we'd grown apart and I was trying to fix it. He said I was fixing it by lying to him and to Landon. I said he was twisting my words. He said I'd twisted reality. Then he stood up, walked past me and went upstairs. I heard him moving things around in the bedroom. A few minutes later, he came back down with a pillow and a blanket. He said he'd be staying in the guest room from now on. I tried to stop him. I said we could talk through this, that we didn't need to be dramatic. He said he wasn't being dramatic, he was being clear. He walked into the guest room and closed the door quietly. I stood in the hallway, my hand shaking, not sure what had just happened. I wanted to knock, to make him listen, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the look in his eyes. Not anger, not sadness, just resolution. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out where I'd lost control of the narrative. I'd been so sure I could make him understand, that I could frame it in a way that made sense. But he hadn't let me. He'd just named what I'd done and walked away. I heard the printer again, that same mechanical hum from the guest room. It went on for almost an hour. The next morning I took Ivy to school. The pickup line was busy, full of parents and kids streaming through the gates. Morning sunlight made everything look too bright, too cheerful. I parked in my usual spot, and helped Ivy out of her car seat. She grabbed her backpack, the one with the unicorn patch she'd picked out last month. We walked hand in hand toward the entrance. A few of the other mothers stood in small clusters near the doors. Julie, who usually organized playdates, waved, but her smile was tight. Her eyes didn't match it. She looked away quickly, turned back to the woman she was talking to. Amanda, who lived 3 houses down from us, said good morning but kept walking. She didn't stop to chat about the weekend like she normally did. She didn't ask about Ivy's upcoming birthday party. She just nodded and moved past us like we were strangers. I told myself I was imagining it, that people were just busy, distracted by their own morning routines, that the tension I felt was my own anxiety projecting onto innocent interactions. Ivy squeezed my hand and asked if I was okay. I told her of course I was, kissed her forehead, and watched her run inside to join her classmates. Through the glass doors, I could see her teacher greeting the children. Everything looked normal from the outside, but as I walked back to my car, I heard voices. 2 women standing by the fence, half hidden by the oak tree near the sidewalk. They weren't trying to be quiet. One of them said something about an open relationship, the words clear and sharp in the morning air. The other woman laughed, not a kind laugh, and said she couldn't imagine doing that to her husband, that she'd never understand how someone could just throw away trust like that. The first woman agreed, said some people just don't value commitment anymore, that they dress it up as being modern, but really it's just selfishness. I froze. My hand was on my car door, but I couldn't move. They didn't see me, or maybe they did and didn't care. Maybe they wanted me to hear. I got in my car and gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing my ribs. I sat there for a full minute before I could start the engine, watching other parents laugh and chat like their worlds weren't crumbling, like their children weren't asking why Daddy slept in the other room. I drove to work on autopilot, barely registering the turns and stops. When I pulled into the parking garage, I realized I'd been holding my breath for most of the drive. I exhaled slowly and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of the past week had carved itself into my face. I drove to work, trying to shake the feeling. When I got to my office, the floor felt different. The usual energy, people calling across desks, laughter by the coffee machine, felt muted. Priya was at her desk, fingers moving across her keyboard, eyes locked on her screen. I set my bag down and walked over to her cubicle. I said good morning, my voice probably too cheerful, trying too hard to sound normal. She said good morning back, but didn't look up. Her tone was flat, professional, the way you'd greet a stranger in an elevator. I asked if she wanted to grab lunch later. We usually went to the sushi place down the block on Tuesdays. It was our thing. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys for just a second, then said she had plans. No elaboration, no counteroffer for another day, just plans. I nodded and said okay, maybe next week. She didn't respond. I stood there for an awkward moment, waiting for her to say something else, but she just kept typing. I walked back to my desk feeling smaller. I sat down and opened my email. 40 unread messages. Most were routine, project updates, vendor invoices, meeting requests. But one stood out. It was from HR, Janet Mitchell. The subject line was just request for meeting. No context, no details. Just a bland corporate request to confirm a time. I felt my stomach twist. I clicked on it and read the 2-line message. Could you please stop by my office this morning at your earliest convenience? We have a few items to discuss. Thank you, Janet. I spent the morning distracted, checking my phone every few minutes, refreshing social media, anything to avoid thinking about what HR wanted. I watched the clock, like it was counting down to something inevitable. At lunch, I went to the break room, hoping to find someone to talk to, someone to make me feel like I wasn't being slowly erased from the social fabric of the office. Priya was there with 2 other colleagues from the design team. When I walked in, they stopped talking. Not subtly. They just stopped mid-sentence and looked at me. I poured coffee, my hand shaking slightly, and tried to join the conversation. I asked what they were talking about. One of them, Marcus from Creative, said just weekend plans. Nothing exciting. The other, a woman named Jen, smiled politely and said they were actually just leaving. Priya stood up without meeting my eyes and followed them out. Within 30 seconds, I was alone in the break room, holding a mug of coffee I didn't even want. I poured it down the sink and went back to my desk. The rest of the morning felt like walking through fog. That afternoon, I went to HR. The woman, Janet, asked me to sit down. She said they'd received some concerns about workplace dynamics. I asked what kind of concerns. She said there had been reports of tension between me and colleagues in another department. I asked who. She said she couldn't share specifics, but that it involved personal matters affecting professional relationships. I realized she was talking about Landon. I said there was nothing inappropriate happening. She said she wasn't making accusations, just wanted to ensure everyone felt comfortable. I left the meeting feeling like the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, Derek had finished his workday and driven straight to the gym across town. It was a place he'd been coming to for years, long before everything started falling apart. The familiar smell of rubber mats and cleaning solution hit him as he walked through the glass doors. Omar was already there, running on one of the treadmills near the window. His pace was steady, rhythmic. Derek set his gym bag down in a locker, changed into his workout clothes, and got on the machine next to him. They ran in silence for the first few minutes. The sound of their footfalls and the hum of the belt motors filled the space between them. Derek focused on his breathing, trying to empty his mind the way he used to before everything got so complicated. But his thoughts kept circling back, to the text message, to the timeline document he'd been building, to the look on my face when I'd tried to gaslight him in our bedroom. Omar slowed his pace to a jog and glanced over. He asked if everything was okay at home. His tone was careful, like he knew the answer, but wanted to give Derek the space to say it or not. Derek kept running for another 30 seconds before responding. He said it was complicated. That was the word everyone used when they didn't want to explain how bad things really were. Omar nodded, not pushing. He said he'd noticed Derek seemed off lately, more distant, that he'd been working out alone more often, coming to the gym later, staying longer. Derek slowed his treadmill down to a walk, then hit stop. He wiped his face with a towel and said he was handling things. Omar asked if he needed help. Derek said no, not yet. That he was just getting things in order. Those words again. In order. Like his life was a project that needed proper documentation and phase gates. Omar said if Derek ever needed to talk, he was there. Derek thanked him, said he appreciated it, and meant it. After their workout, they went to the locker room. The place was mostly empty, just a couple of older guys by the showers, talking about a basketball game. Derek opened his gym bag to grab his towel. The zipper stuck for a second, and when he yanked it, the bag tilted. Inside, Omar caught a glimpse of what Derek had been carrying. File folders, neatly labeled, printed emails, pages stacked and paper clipped together. A small digital recorder, the kind lawyers use for dictation. A thumb drive taped to the inside of a manila envelope. Omar raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything at first. Then quietly, so the other guys wouldn't hear, he asked what all that was. Derek looked down at the bag, then back at Omar. He said it was just documentation. Omar asked for what. Derek said for when he needed it. For when things got formal. Omar understood then. He'd been through a divorce himself 3 years ago. He knew what it looked like when someone was preparing for war, even if they were doing it quietly. Omar sat down on the bench and lowered his voice even more. He said Derek was being smart about it, that a lot of guys just react, yell, break things, and end up with nothing to show for it but regret and legal fees. Derek nodded. He said he wasn't going to make that mistake, that he'd learned a long time ago that emotion without evidence was just noise. Omar asked if Derek had talked to a lawyer yet. Derek said yes, that he'd had a consultation last week, that things were already in motion. Omar asked if I knew. Derek said not yet. That I'd know soon enough. He zipped up his gym bag, carefully this time, and stood. He told Omar he'd see him next week. Omar stood too and put a hand on Derek's shoulder. He said to hang in there. That doing things the right way took longer, but it lasted. Derek nodded, grabbed his bag, and left the locker room. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed with a reminder. Downtown, 7:30 p.m. He had another meeting tonight, another step in the process, another piece of the case he was building. That evening, Derek came home late again. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone. I'd posted something on Instagram earlier that day. Some people can't handle a woman who refuses to shrink. It had gotten a lot of likes, a lot of supportive comments from people who didn't know the full story. But it also got some quiet unfollows. I noticed Priya wasn't in my follower list anymore. Derek walked past me without saying anything. I asked where he'd been. He said the gym. I asked if we could talk. He said he was tired. I stood up and said we couldn't keep ignoring each other. He turned around and said he wasn't ignoring me, he was protecting himself. I asked from what? He said from more lies. Then he went upstairs. I heard the guest room door close. I went into the kitchen and opened my laptop. I wanted to see what he'd been working on. His computer was password protected, but mine wasn't. I checked our shared cloud folder. There were new files there. One labeled Household. I clicked on it. Inside was a document titled Timeline. I started reading. Every conversation we'd had, every text, every time I'd claimed we'd agreed on something we hadn't. It was all there, organized by date, with notes in the margins. My hand started shaking. I scrolled down and saw screenshots, messages between me and Landon, the text he'd accidentally sent to Derek, a note about my Instagram post, another about the HR meeting. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark. He'd been documenting everything, not in anger, but methodically, like a project he was managing. I felt sick. I wanted to delete it, to confront him, to make him stop, but I knew it was too late. He'd already saved everything somewhere I couldn't reach. The next few days blurred together. I kept trying to act normal, to pretend everything was fine. But Ivy started asking questions. She asked why Daddy slept in the other room. I told her he was working on something important. She asked if we were still a family. I said of course we were. She didn't look convinced. At school, the distance from other parents grew. They stopped including me in group texts. Playdates dried up. I told myself it was because people were small-minded, that they couldn't handle anything outside their narrow view of what a marriage should look like. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew they were talking, that someone had said something, that the story I'd tried to control was being rewritten without me. One evening, Derek's sister Mara called and invited us to dinner at her house. I said we'd love to come. Derek overheard and said he'd already accepted. I asked why he hadn't told me. He said he'd just done so. The dinner was set for Saturday. I dreaded it, but I couldn't say no without making things worse. Saturday came too quickly. I woke up with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away no matter how much coffee I drank. Derek and I drove separately, the way we did everything now. He took Ivy with him. I watched them pull out of the driveway, Ivy waving at me from the back seat, oblivious to the fact that this dinner was going to be anything but normal. I followed 10 minutes later, giving them time to arrive first. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel. When I got to Mara's house, the driveway was already full. Derek's car, his mother Eleanor's sedan, my mother Gwen's SUV. Even Simon's car was there, which surprised me. He usually avoided family gatherings, said they were too stressful. The fact that he'd made the effort to come tonight made my stomach drop even further. This wasn't just dinner. This was an intervention, an ambush, a reckoning. I walked up the front steps and knocked. Mara answered, her face neutral but her eyes cold. She didn't hug me. She just stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The living room was full. Eleanor sat on the couch with Ivy, who was colouring on a placemat with crayons spread out around her. Gwen was in the armchair by the window, her reading glasses perched on her nose, scrolling through her phone. Simon stood in the kitchen doorway talking to his wife, both of them holding wine glasses. Derek was nowhere in sight. Mara led me to the dining room. The table was already set, plates and silverware arranged perfectly, a centerpiece of white flowers in the middle. It looked like a stage set. Too deliberate, too formal. Derek came in from the hallway, carrying a bottle of wine. He set it on the table without looking at me. Mara asked everyone to sit. Slowly, they filtered in. Gwen took the seat next to me, her hand briefly touching my shoulder in what I think was meant to be reassurance. Eleanor sat across from me, her face drawn, tired. Simon and his wife took the end seats. Mara sat at the head of the table. Derek sat as far from me as possible. We passed dishes in silence. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. The food looked good, but no one was really eating. Everyone was just moving food around their plates, waiting for someone to break the silence. Finally, Mara set down her fork with a deliberate clink against the china. She looked directly at me and asked if Derek and I were doing okay. Her tone was measured, but there was an edge to it. A challenge. I forced a smile and said we were fine, just going through a transition. That word again, transition. Like it was a phase, a temporary adjustment, not a total collapse. Mara asked what kind of transition. I glanced at Derek, but he was staring at his plate. I said we were exploring a more open arrangement. Gwen nodded supportively, said that many couples were finding new ways to structure their relationships, that it was a sign of maturity to question traditional models. Eleanor's face tightened, but she said nothing. Mara leaned forward, her eyes never leaving mine. She asked if Derek had agreed to that. The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone stopped pretending to eat. I felt Gwen's hand on my arm, a silent signal to stay calm. I said of course he had, that we'd discussed it thoroughly, that we were both committed to making it work. Derek finally looked up. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not anger, not hurt. Something worse. Disappointment. Mara picked up her phone from beside her plate. She unlocked it and turned the screen toward the center of the table so everyone could see. She said she wanted to share something. She read aloud, her voice clear and cold. "Baby, tonight at my place? Can't wait to have you alone again." She added that it was followed by a winking emoji. The room went completely silent. Not even the sound of breathing. Gwen asked for context, her voice sharp, defensive. I tried to laugh it off, said it was taken out of context, that Landon had been joking, that he had a strange sense of humor, and I'd already told him to stop. Mara set her phone down and asked me directly if Derek had actually agreed to an open relationship. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Simon leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, his face unreadable. Mara pressed harder. She asked if I'd told Landon that Derek approved. I said Landon had misunderstood. Mara said that wasn't an answer. She said it was a yes or no question. Had I told Landon that Derek knew and approved? I looked at Derek, hoping he'd step in, defend me, say something that would diffuse this. But he just sat there, silent, watching me drown. I said Landon had made assumptions. Mara said that was still not an answer. Gwen stood up and said this was inappropriate, that we were ambushing me, that this was between Derek and me and no one else. Mara turned to her and said it stopped being private when I started lying to everyone, when I dragged Landon into it, when I made Derek look like a fool in front of his friends and family. The doorbell rang. The sound was so sudden and sharp it made me jump. Mara stood and walked to the door. I heard voices in the hallway. A woman's voice, shaky, upset. Then Mara came back into the dining room. She wasn't alone. Behind her was Tessa Hayes, Landon's wife. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might be sick. Tessa stood in the doorway, her eyes red like she'd been crying for days. She looked around the table and her gaze landed on me. She said she was sorry to interrupt, but she needed to say something. that she'd been carrying it around for too long, and it was eating her alive. Mara gestured to an empty chair, but Tessa stayed standing. She said Landon had confessed everything the night before, that I'd told him Derek was fine with it, that Derek had supposedly given his blessing, that they had what Landon called an understanding. Tessa's voice cracked. She said she was leaving him, that she'd already packed a bag and was staying with her sister. But before she left, she wanted Derek to know he wasn't alone, that she believed him, that she'd seen the texts Landon had saved, the ones where I'd told him not to worry, that Derek was progressive, that we'd talked about opening things up. She pulled out her phone and held it up, showing screenshots, messages I'd sent Landon, messages where I'd said Derek was on board, messages where I'd called Derek too serious but ultimately supportive. The room erupted. Gwen said this was a violation of privacy, that Tessa had no right to share private communications. Eleanor started crying openly now, her hands covering her face. Simon looked at me like he didn't know who I was. Mara just sat back down, her point made, her case presented. Ivy, who'd been colouring quietly in the living room, started crying. The sound cut through everything else. Derek stood up immediately and went to her. He knelt beside her and spoke softly, asking if she was okay. She said the yelling scared her. He said he was sorry, that sometimes grown-ups talk too loud when they're upset. He lifted her gently and said they were leaving. I stood up too, said we needed to stay and work through this. Derek turned to me, Ivy in his arms, and said there was nothing to work through, that the truth was already out, that everyone had heard it from multiple sources, that there was no more room for my version of events. He carried Ivy toward the door. I tried to follow, but Gwen grabbed my arm. She said we should leave too. Simon called after me and said we needed to talk, just him and me soon. I nodded, but I couldn't process anything. Tessa was still standing there, tears streaming down her face, apologizing to the room. Mara walked her out, thanking her for coming, telling her she was brave. The sound of Derek's car starting outside was the last thing I heard before Gwen pulled me toward the door. I turned to face everyone. Gwen said we should go too, that this was hostile. Mara said no, it was honest. Simon asked me if Derek had ever actually agreed. I couldn't answer. Tessa left quietly. Gwen and I left soon after. No one said goodbye. The next day, I took Ivy to the park. I wanted to show her that things were normal, that we were still a family. But at the playground, the other parents avoided us. Ivy ran toward a girl she usually played with. The girl's father gently steered his daughter toward the swings on the other side. Ivy came back to me and asked why no one wanted to play. I said they were just busy. She asked if it was because of Daddy. I said no. She didn't believe me. We left after 20 minutes. On the way to the car, I saw Derek's car parked across the street. He was sitting inside, phone to his ear, writing something on a notepad. When he saw me looking, he ended the call and drove away. I felt like I was being watched, documented, like every move I made was being recorded for some purpose I couldn't see yet. That night, after Ivy was asleep, I found a binder on the dining table. It was labeled Utilities. I opened it. Inside was a USB drive taped to the inside cover. I pulled it out and plugged it into my laptop. The drive contained everything: screenshots of texts, transcripts of conversations, photos of social media posts, witness statements from Tessa, from Omar, from people I didn't even know were paying attention. There was even a recording. I clicked on it. It was from the night I'd told him about the open relationship. My voice, saying he'd agreed implicitly. His voice, saying he hadn't. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark. He'd been building a case, not for revenge, but for protection. I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was fear. The next morning I called Simon. My hands were shaking as I dialed. I told him I needed legal advice. He was quiet for a moment, then said he'd meet me at his office. His tone was professional, distant, not the warm brotherly voice I was used to. I said I could be there in an hour. He said that would work. I drove downtown feeling like I was walking into a trap I'd set for myself. Simon's office was in one of those glass and steel towers that made you feel small just looking at it. I parked in the visitor lot and took the elevator to the 14th floor. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, asked my name and told me to have a seat. The waiting area had leather chairs and magazines I didn't read. I just sat there staring at the wall, trying to rehearse what I'd say. Simon came out 10 minutes later. He was wearing a suit, his lawyer uniform, which made everything feel more formal and frightening. He shook my hand like I was a client, not his sister. He led me down a hallway lined with conference rooms, all glass, all visible. We went into one at the end. He closed the door and gestured for me to sit. He sat across from me, not beside me. That small distance felt enormous. He asked what I needed. I took a breath and said I needed help protecting my rights. He asked what rights. I said custody, assets, the house. Everything that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. He leaned back in his chair and asked if Derek had documentation. I nodded. He asked if I'd seen it. I said yes, some of it, enough to know it was bad. Simon pulled his laptop toward him and opened a folder. He said Derek had already sent him copies. He'd done it as a courtesy to the family, to make sure everyone understood what was happening before it went public. Simon scrolled through the files slowly, his face unreadable. I watched his eyes move across the screen. I saw him pause on certain pages, saw his jaw tighten. After what felt like forever, he looked up at me. He said he couldn't represent me. I felt my chest tighten. I asked why. He said conflict of interest. He said Derek had been transparent with him, had shared everything willingly. That the documentation was thorough, time-stamped, corroborated by multiple witnesses. He said if I wanted to fight this, I'd need someone else. Someone who didn't know both sides. Someone who could look at the case objectively, without family loyalty clouding things. I asked what he meant by thorough. Simon turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a timeline. Dates, conversations, screenshots of texts. My Instagram posts with annotations. Witness statements from Tessa, from Omar, from people at my workplace. Even recordings. Audio files labeled with dates and times. I felt sick. I asked if all of this was admissible. Simon said most of it was. That Derek had been careful to follow the law. That he'd documented things in ways that would hold up in court. I asked Simon if he thought I'd lose custody. He was silent for a long time before saying he couldn't predict a judge. But courts didn't look kindly on dishonesty, manipulation, or unstable environments. He said the evidence showed a pattern: lying, gaslighting, prioritizing my needs over Ivy's safety. A judge would see all of it. I blinked back tears and asked what to do. Simon told me to hire an attorney. And be completely honest. No spin. No reframing. Derek had built his case with facts. If I built mine with excuses, I'd lose before I started. He wrote down a name and said she'd take my call, but she'd ask hard questions I'd have to answer truthfully. I asked if Derek hated me. Simon said no. Derek was acting out of necessity, not spite. I asked if he hated me. He said no, just disappointed. That I'd had choices at every step and chosen the wrong ones. Before I left, he said one last thing. If I wanted any chance of joint custody or rebuilding anything with Ivy, I had to stop defending myself and start accepting responsibility. My narrative didn't match reality anymore, and everyone could see it. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before calling the attorney. She said she could see me tomorrow at 10. That evening, Derek came home early. He said he needed to pack. A temporary arrangement. When I begged him not to go, he said the paperwork was filed. I grabbed his arm, promised I'd stop seeing Landon, begged for another chance. He said the time for anything was before, not after. He packed a bag while I followed him down the hall, insisting Ivy needed both of us. He said Ivy needed stability, truth, things I hadn't provided. When I accused him of cruelty, he said he was being proper. He told me Ivy would be with his mother for the weekend. When I protested, he said I'd see her. But not this weekend. When I asked if he was taking her from me, He said no. A court might. He paused at the door and said trust had been the only mistake he'd made, and he wouldn't make it again. After he left, a new calendar event appeared on my phone. Tomorrow, 11 a.m., community center. Derek still had access to our shared calendar. It felt like a warning. I barely slept. The next morning, I drove to the community center, Ivy's school art show. I'd forgotten. Derek hadn't. Parents gathered in the lobby, teachers at the tables, Ivy's drawings on the wall. When a man approached and said my name, I answered automatically. He handed me a thick envelope. "You've been served." The lobby fell silent. Phones came out. People stared. I opened the packet with shaking hands. Divorce petition, temporary orders, primary residence to Derek pending evaluation, financial restrictions, accounts frozen. Mara stepped forward and said, "He did this properly." The word stung. I read the declaration. 12 pages of every lie, every message, every manipulation. Witnesses listed: Omar, Tessa, Mara, Simon, even Priya. A custody evaluation recommended due to documented dishonesty. I stumbled outside and reached my car. I texted Derek. No answer. Called. Blocked. I texted Landon. He served me in public. "Did he serve you?" He responded, "Tessa did. We're done. Leave me alone." Everyone had already moved on. I drove to a coffee shop and reread the orders. Supervised visitation, spending caps, more evidence attached, screenshots, timelines, credit card receipts. Everything was airtight. Through the window, I saw Derek's car pass with Ivy in the back. I waved. They didn't look. That evening, I went home. The house felt too big, too empty. Later, Derek arrived to pack more things. I asked if we could talk. He said there was nothing left to say. I asked if he hated me. He said no, he just didn't trust me, and trust was the foundation I had destroyed. He said Ivy would be fine as long as adults were honest. I claimed I'd been honest. He said no, I'd been trying to control the narrative. Before he left, he said he hoped one day I'd understand what I'd done. Not just to him, but to myself. When the door closed, I sat in the dark. The last page of the petition echoed in my mind. This is not revenge. This is restoration. And I finally understood. Derek wasn't punishing me. He was protecting himself. Protecting Ivy. Restoring order to a life I'd thrown into chaos. Calmly, methodically, properly. I looked at the court date marked in red. 2 weeks. Simon's text glowed on my screen. "They'll need honesty. Can you do that?" For the first time, I didn't try to justify or reframe. I just stared at the truth. I texted back, "Yes, I can try." I called the attorney and confirmed my appointment. Then I sat in the silence of the house I'd destroyed, knowing Derek had already won. Not out of cruelty, but because he'd built a case out of truth while I'd built my life on lies. I looked around the kitchen one last time. 2 mugs on opposite counters, the guest room door closed, a home turned into a crime scene, 2 weeks until court, time to stop lying, time to face what I'd done, and maybe, if honesty meant anything anymore, time to start becoming someone Ivy could trust again.